start, I got a couple announcements before we start. Number one, you paid to get in here. We have a individual membership that what your cover price to get in here is 25% of the annual cost of that membership. If you want to take the money you paid tonight and go back past the front desk on your way out, you can apply it to an annual membership. Annual membership allows you to come in as many times as you want throughout the year. So that's number one. Number two, we have got, I'm going to tell you about some future events we're going to have. One of them is going to be how Kaskaskia Island got farmed. And there's been a lot of people tell me how it got farmed, but not many people got it right. So we're going to have a statement about that, when the island actually was cut off from the state of Illinois, how that happened, and the events that took place. And we'll talk about the curse of Kaskaskia Island. So that's always a good story. And the other speaker we're going to have come in is going to be about the New Madrid earthquake.
Oh.
Guys, that is one fascinating story. 1811, 1812, in 8 short weeks, they had 6 earthquakes. Now, the information I got, they had 6 of them that went over 8.0 on the Richter scale.
Wow.
Is that, I can't say that's bona fide, Bob, would you say back then?
I don't know that they measured them.
I don't know how they figured it out, but I got a map.
Yeah, and it went up the Ohio Valley. I think it was only about a 6 here, they estimate.
So the Mississippi River ran backwards. There was 2 waterfalls on the Mississippi River. Reelfoot Lake was farmed, so we'll have that speech in here too. So those are future speaker series that we already got, plus a gentleman by the name of Charlie Duckworth, who wrote the book about the M&I Railroad, is going to come in on March the 18th, I believe it is, and talk about all of the railroad from Bismarck, Missouri, over to wherever they ended up in Illinois. And he's going to give that presentation. So we got good presentations coming up. So for you tonight, we got Father Nemeth. He's going to talk about the Church of Sainte Genevieve and the history of the church. But before I do that, I got one question. How many people in here are Knights of Columbus members? If you are, raise your hand, please. Folks, these people paid for this presentation tonight. Round of applause. Thank you very much for doing that for us. Father?
I'd like to echo that. I'd like to thank my brother Knights for sponsoring this talk. Hope you'll find that it was worthwhile. Though I am an educator by training, I'm not an academic, so the thought of standing up to give a lecture is rather intimidating to me, especially when there's people like Bob Muir in the room who've written most of the history. So if there's anything wrong, it's Lucille Bosler's fault. Lucille was my primary source for a lot of this, and digging with a little bit of research through the Archdiocese of New Orleans, which I'll talk about a little bit. So tonight, I'm not going to focus so much on the history of the town because there's much better people equipped to handle that. You can go to any of our wonderful educational facilities here in the town and get that story. But what I want to impress to you tonight is this idea of how Sainte Genevieve was really kind of a linchpin when it comes to the spreading of the Catholic faith, not just here, but in the entire westward expansion. And I will say, if you really want to do a deep dive and understand more of the Catholic Church's expansion through the westward expansion, I would recommend Father Michael Witt. Any of you here when he was associate pastor? Woo! Old. Okay, so Father Michael Witt is one of the more renowned historians of church history. He taught me at the seminary. He still teaches at the seminary. And he put together a multi-volume work about the expansion of the Catholic Church in the United States. And his first volume does cover Sainte Genevieve very comprehensively. So all of his lectures and talks and notes you can find online. So if you Google Father Mike Witt, you'll find those resources. So I want to talk tonight a little bit about ecclesiology which is the fancy term in the church for the theological study of the church itself. And that is going to kind of set some of the framework, especially if you're not Catholic or not familiar with the church's structures. Some of what I'm going to say could sound foreign, so I want to start with that. Then we'll walk through kind of like how did the church as an institution form a diocese here, which will kind of draw off what I'm going to talk about with the ecclesiology, and then we'll get down into the nitty-gritty of kind of the timeline of this church, where I want to talk about particularly the different churches, some of the notable pastors, because we were blessed to have very notable pastors that played a major role, not just in our community, but also even in the expansion of the Missouri Territory, okay? And then we'll talk a little bit about Catholic education, because as Lucille Bosler said in her really great work, you can't do this without discussing the good sisters that spent so many centuries educating the youth of this town. So, again, I want to thank Bob for the invitation. Actually, I think it was Sarah Menard who texted me about doing this. But this is a fantastic place that we have in St. Genevieve. And the first time when Bob was telling me about the idea of it, talking about dinosaurs, I'm like, dinosaurs? We have dinosaurs? And as you go through the exhibits, you understand, especially the most recent discovery, that was national news, international news. It is worth taking some time to kind of go through the anthropological side of the exhibits here and the lab, then also going upstairs and seeing more of the exhibits about the history of the town. There's several items that are on loan from the parish to the museum here that I felt were good items that I could do without on a Sunday to be able to have here on display. We also have some items on reserve at the Center for French Colonial Life. So there's a lot of neat things about the church that you can see. But as Bob was telling me, he said right before we started, he said, you probably have a bunch of artifacts that you could have brought tonight. I said, well, yeah, but most of them we're using. These are not museum pieces. When the Presbyterian Church asked me if they could have on loan Antoine O'Neill's holy water bucket, when I brought it down to them, they were kind of not scandalized, but I was kind of nonchalant with them. Well, we use this all the time. This isn't an art piece. It is something we use in the liturgy. So that is kind of, to understand the history is to understand Catholicism. That these things are not museum pieces for us. They're things that we use in the worship of Almighty God. So I'm going to start by talking about ecclesiology. So I don't actually have any notes for this part, so I'm going to kind of walk over here. When Christ founded the church, he entrusted the church after his death and resurrection to the apostles. And of course, he chose St. Peter, as imperfect as he was, to be that central figure, that first among equals, to be that rock, because Peter's name actually wasn't Peter, he was Simon, but Christ changed his name. As we see in Scripture, whenever God gave someone a mission, there was usually a change in their name. So Abram became Abraham, right? So Peter became the central figure of unity for the church. And as the apostles went out from the region of the Holy Lands that we understand and started building communities of faith all throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East, we started to see the church gather around these apostles. Now, these apostles are not going to live forever. So eventually, after the apostle would die, another priest of that time, of that area would be selected to be that leader of that local church. So we usually think of the Catholic Church as this large conglomerate organization of which our parishes are all franchises, but that's not true. The church subsists in these smaller gatherings of churches. So in the entire world, we have about 4,500 local churches, which we call dioceses. Or, if they're really big and important, have a lot of people, an archdiocese. So as the apostles died, their successors would take their place. And this begins what we in the church can draw all the way back to the time of Christ, what we call apostolicity. That every bishop ordained in the church right now, you can draw a line from them to the bishop that ordained them all the way back to the hands of Christ and St. Peter. So when we talk about some of the foundations of this new diocese, really it is the most grassroots understanding of the local church being gathered together because of its geographic areas, because of its nationalities, because of its cultures. So now, 2,000 years later, 4,500 bishops are all throughout the world, and we believe them to be successors of the apostles. And most of them, like the apostles, are not the most brilliant and aren't even the greatest. But you can laugh at that. I get paid the same. I don't know. So in the church exists in these communities called dioceses around the local bishop. So that is how I'm going to kind of transition into how did the local church in St. Genevieve start to be a part of kind of a larger community of faith. So if we want to look at the story of the Catholic Church of St. Genevieve is really a story of the westward expansion of the Catholic faith. It was here, of course, the first parish west of the Mississippi, the first settlement in what is now the state of Missouri. This was the jumping off point. At one point, St. Genevieve was more illustrious and important than even the city of St. Louis. During the European settlement of Louisiana that took place in the 17th and 18th centuries, we see a period of exploration and also empire building. So, and although the Spanish were the first to explore the Gulf Coast in Florida, it was actually the French from Canada who established a permanent colony on the shores of the Mississippi, down in the Louisiana Territory. On April 9th, 1682, Bill, this is where the quiz comes in, so take notes. Okay. On April 9th, 1682, Robert Cavalier de La Salle planted the cross on Louisiana soil, claiming the lower Mississippi Valley in the name of God and the French king. And the territory was named Louisiane, after King Louis XIV. Now we know what happens. The French territory eventually becomes under the control of the Spanish, and we will see then an establishment of the diocese. The French were never able to actually establish its own diocese. So remember, in a diocese, that bishop is responsible for the spiritual care of all the souls in that territory. Okay, we call that jurisdiction. So as the church is expanding into new territory that is being explored and has never been founded, someone is responsible for the care of the souls, be they only a dozen. So we see the foundation of, so this territory was originally part of the Diocese of Quebec in Canada, Santiago de Cuba, and Havana. And in 1793, they finally formed the Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas. And this created the first bishop in the region, Luis Penaver y Cardenas. And he was a native of Havana, Cuba. And he took up his residence in New Orleans. So here's the thing about bishops. Dioceses are all centered around wherever the bishop is. And that's what makes his church, what we call a cathedral, so important. Because cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning chair. So wherever the chair of the bishop is where the diocese is. Okay? So this new diocese was formed, and the bishop takes up his residence and his chair in New Orleans. After he moves on, Bishop Louis William Valentine de Burgh, does that sound familiar? Right? De Burgh became the Bishop of Louisiana and the Floridas, and he maintained his residence in St. Louis and not in New Orleans, because at this time, this diocese incorporates all of what we now would refer to as the Louisiana Purchase. Think of the size of that diocese. Okay, it's huge. It's huge. So, and in this town, we have a very interesting tie to Bishop de Burgh. So, at the time when Bishop de Burgh was making it very clear that he wanted to kind of move the see to St. Louis, there was discussion as to whether or not the see would be in St. Genevieve or St. Louis. And one of the French bishops said he wanted to be in St. Genevieve because St. Louis had one of those theaters. And you know how people get with those theaters, right? So they were very, very worried about the lack of faith and kind of the destitution that would come from having one of those theaters. So, but Bishop DeBerg makes his way up the river to take possession of his new house in St. Louis in the year 1818. Now, if you're a St. Louis person, 1818 is a big year for us, because 1818 was, of course, the foundation of St. Louis University, my alma mater, which was the first Catholic college west of the Mississippi. DeBerg, on his way when he took possession of the diocese on January 4th of 1818, actually stops here in St. Genevieve, gets off the steamboat, and comes to the town. And actually, the pastor at the time wasn't here. He was in St. Louis helping with the preparations. So a couple of years ago, in 2018, we had this bicentennial celebration, and as I was kind of looking at the history, I thought, nobody in the diocese is doing anything about this. So we hosted a solemn high mass in the extraordinary form, the old traditional Latin mass. Because when DeBerg landed here on the 1st of January, 1818, that's exactly what he celebrated in the church. Now, understand, most people in churches going to Mass would have got kind of what we have in our church, the 6 a.m., right? Quick and dirty, right? Very little music. So to have a bishop here and all the different ceremonies that go with it, it must have been an amazing thing to experience. So they decided that the Gateway of the West, St. Louis, that was growing so much, would be the place for Bishop DeBerg to make his seat, even though it was still the Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas. In 1826, the Diocese of St. Louis is formed. Now, the Diocese of St. Louis incorporates all the way back down to New Orleans, and will incorporate all of the entire area of the Louisiana Purchase. At that time, Bishop Joseph Rosati, right, we know Rosati Kane High School in the city, it's been in the news a lot. Bishop Rosati was a Vincentian and a native of the Kingdom of Naples. Now remember, Italy, it wasn't until the 1880s that Italy becomes a unified country. So there were various areas, the Papal States, and then of course the Kingdom of Naples. So Rosati comes here, and when kind of chose where to go, he said, I want to be in St. Louis, because he felt in New Orleans a lot of the odious influence of the Enlightenment philosophy had really tainted that area, where it becomes somewhat godless and anti-religion. Now remember, the Enlightenment philosophy that comes about before the French Revolution is really the basis for even our American Republic. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? Well, in John Locke, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. But be that as it may, they took some liberty. So we see that there was kind of this fear in New Orleans of this anti-religious sentiment. And of course, the Enlightenment will bring about what I consider to be one of the most heinous acts of Western history, which is the French Revolution. So that's why I always kind of cringe whenever we're in Sainte Genevieve and we sing La Marseillaise, because we are royalists. We are royalists here, by God. We don't believe in the French. So even if you, fun fact, this is why it's going to take longer than I thought. When you walk into most churches when you travel, especially when you travel internationally, there is a little sign hanging in the sacristy where the priest vests for Mass. And it always has listed the name of the church, and the name of the bishop, and the name of whoever the president, prime minister, king, or queen is. So when you come into St. Genevieve, I found this, which goes way back. It's leather and it's beautiful. So St. Genevieve is in there. And then, of course, our Bishop Mitchell. Because in Eucharistic prayer, the priest has to name the name of the bishop where they're celebrating Mass. Fun fact, if you had Mass on the moon, who would be the bishop? There's an answer to it. On the moon. If I had Mass on the moon. My little space boots. Very good. It would be the Diocese of Orlando, because that is where the Apollo missions launched from. So the Bishop of Orlando is the Bishop of the Moon. And that's the only reason I would be Bishop of Orlando, so I can be Bishop of the Moon. Where's I going with all that? Oh, so on that little plaque when you come to church, when it says Oratio Imperat, meaning pray for the ruler. So, like, we still have in ours, we pray for Louis XX, the Duc d'Anjou, who is the rightful heir to the throne of France. So, there's no political statement to that, just we're royalists here. So, France has continued, even if only in our memory. So this is one of the reasons why Rosati says he wants to make his home in St. Louis, because he wants to get away from this real strong French influence of the Enlightenment coming across the sea. So the Diocese of St. Louis, as I said, would originally comprise the area of the Louisiana Purchase, and almost every diocese west of the Mississippi would be carved out of St. Louis. So if you look at the heraldry, the coats of arms of the various dioceses, you will always see kind of a nod as an homage to St. Louis. Even the Archdiocese of Chicago was formed out of St. Louis. St. Louis would be later elevated to, I don't remember the date, elevated to be an archdiocese, the second archdiocese in the United States. What was the first one? Baltimore, very good. Baltimore is our primatial see. It was the first archdiocese, St. Louis being the second. You're probably wondering, when are we going to get to the history of our parish? But this is all important to understand, that this global chess game of empires, exploration, economies, this constant reality of the cross and the crown are essential to understand how this place that we love and enjoy to live came to be. So I'm going to talk about the parish now, but I'm not going to go too much in the history of the founding of the city itself, as I said earlier. You can read books on that. You can find that. I'm talking more about the parish history. In the beginning, to quote Lucio Basler, in the beginning there was one house, a cabin or two for slaves, and a barn and a shed. And this was the property of Andre de Geer LaRose. Okay, we're going to hear those names come up again. And Andre LaRose moved from Kaskaskia to the west side of the river. And I had all these things to talk about how the river had shifted, but I'm going to defer to the expert when he comes to talk about Kaskaskia. So that's like 3 pages off of my talk. You don't have to do.
You're welcome.
Yeah. That martini ain't making itself at home, so, all right. So, remember, Kaskaskia was on that side of the Mississippi River at that time, and that's all I'll say. The French Canadians followed Father Marquette. So, I love this. In Illinois, there's a state park called Pierre Marquette. It's like, his name wasn't Pierre. Père is the French term for father. So, luckily, we in town, the park towards the north of the city is Père Marquette State Park. So, Marquette and several other great missionaries at the time had journeyed with the explorers as they made their discoveries. So Father Marquette comes down to Mississippi, and a lot of these Canadians are making their way into the mid-Mississippi Valley, and they're escaping the threat of being ruled, God help us all, by the English in Canada. Their main reason for moving to the west bank of the Mississippi was to establish a shipping post for the lead that was being mined about 30 miles to the west. Here's a funny story. So I'm an Eagle Scout. I was very involved with the Boy Scouts for a long time, many years of my life. I spent many summers at the SBAR-F Scout Ranch, which is about 10 miles south of Farmington, 5 miles north of Fredericktown. It is a very historic property. The Scouts bought it from the St. Joseph Lead Mine Company in the 1960s, and it had been completely deforested. And there was a huge quarry there, because they were quarrying the granite from that quarry on that property to support their mining operations. So eventually a beautiful camp was made, and a 5,200 acre camp with a 1,200 acre lake, which of course is man-made, and that quarry makes up the deepest end of it. So at the ranch, there's certain historical things you get to know as you're there a little longer. The big connection of people going through that property worked at Mine Lamont. Now, I'd heard that a million times, I had no idea what that was, and I moved here, and I'm like, everybody knows what Mine Lamont is, right? So Mine Lamont, the products from there would go straight through on what's called the 3-notch trail. So there was a trail that would run to St. Genevieve from there that was marked the trail with 3 notches. And that's what the 2 loops of the hiking trail at SBAR-F are still called to this day, the 3-notch trail. There are areas where you can see the original wagon ruts on some of the trails. There's an original settler's cabin with the hand-hewn nails. And there is something that is rather secret to the community there. There's a cemetery. And it wasn't until about the 80s that the family finally abandoned that cemetery. But they would take their wagon from Fredericktown and come and visit the cemetery. We keep the location hidden so that the staffers on their nights off aren't going and hanging out at the cemetery. But it was kind of a sacred thing for me every year to take a crew to the cemetery at this location that if you stumbled upon it, you wouldn't know it was a cemetery, but it was in such disrepair. So we ended up building a fence around it, the headstones, the footstones, and even that telltale sign of old graves, that kind of sunken indentation. And that's why we really have vaults, and that's why Eric's charging us so much. Vaults go in the ground mainly to keep, so that Neil doesn't get bounced off his mower when he's trying to mow the graves, right? This is going to take forever. We're going to be like 4 hours. We have a bar open? No? Okay. You should have brought your own. Okay. So that's my anecdotal story, as I put in here. So in the early days of the settlement of Sainte Genevieve, the faithful were ministered by the Jesuit priests from the mission in Kaskaskia. So the priests from Kaskaskia would come over here, celebrate Mass, baptisms, and all that. The parish territory of Kaskaskia extended from the Vincennes area to the western edge of the Louisiana Purchase. It was huge. The parish of Sainte Genevieve was originally known as St. Joachim. Now I know down here we like to call it St. Joachim, but it's St. Joachim, of course, who was the grandfather of the Blessed Mother. And it was named St. Joachim as a nod to the parish church in Quebec that many of the pioneers came from down into this area. In fact, the early records from Father Mercier refer to St. Joachim many times. So when sacraments happened in St. Genevieve, the records were kept in Kaskaskia. So here's the thing about sacramental records. And this is why we're kind of a gold mine when it comes to those doing genealogy. Nothing in the church happens that isn't written down in sacramental records. So when your kids and grandkids go and get married, one of the first things we say is, you have to get us a baptism record from the church you were baptized. And that's not the keepsake that mom's got down in her basement, right? This is a sacramental record because Deanne goes to the big book, right? And every time someone receives a sacrament, a notification is sent to the church of baptism. I was baptized in St. Nicholas Parish in Berlinsville in Pennsylvania in the Lehigh Valley. So when I received my first Holy Communion, notification went back. When I was confirmed by Cardinal Regali in 1996, notification went back. When I was ordained a deacon in 2007, notification went back. When I was ordained a priest in 2008, notification went back. When you're married, the notification goes back. And God forbid, there is an annulment or a declaration of nullity, that also goes back and is notated. So our sacramental records are a very, very sacred gift, which have been given to the archives of the Archdiocese and digitized. Because you got a book from 1759, it's not holding up that great. So it has all been digitized so that when people want to find information about their family histories and heritages, they don't have to get the greasy fingers all over Deanne's book, right? So I'll talk about that sacramental register at other times, but that is one of the most precious things we have. In fact, once a year, whenever either the bishop or the vicar general comes, they review those books and sign them to make sure that we are keeping proper records of everyone's sacraments. So when the priests were coming from Kaskaskia, those records went over there. It became very clear in time, especially in the year 1752, that there was a need for a parish here in St. Genevieve. The missionary priests that came over would say Mass at the Commandant's house, the Commandant's of the Milice. So the first church would have been a vertical log structure, as we see all around town. That very, very distinct French architecture. If you really want to see what it would have looked like, go to Cahokia, to what they call the Old Log Church. The parish name is Holy Family. But that church has been restored and looks exactly probably what our first and second churches in this parish would have looked like. Beautiful little church, totally worth a side trip. Okay. So in 1759, Father Watrin, a Jesuit, became the first pastor of St. Genevieve. And the first marriage record was of that of André de Guire-Larose, captain of the militia, and Marie Lavoisier of the parish of St. Anne in Fort de Chartres. And this was on February 26th, 1759. And here's what's funny. Before I came down here, I was teaching at St. Pius, and there was a family that I became very close to and still very close to, that the father's family were de Geers. And it wasn't until many years later when I was down here, we drew the connection that they are de Geers, that they are descendants of the de Geers, who were the first marriage in this parish in 1759. So after Father Marin's tenure, the famous Father Pierre Gibault was pastor from 1768 to 1773. Now Father Gibault they called a patriot priest. So he would have been ministering on the other side of the river, and he was influential in kind of the English leaving. So if you go over to Kaskaskia, visit the Liberty Bell, and you can read a little bit more about Father Gibault, who would have been the third priest in the pastorate of Sainte Genevieve. Now I'm not going to go through every 26 of my predecessors, but there's a couple I'm going to highlight because they really were pastors during very, very important times. And it is one of the things when I got here and I looked at the last parish director we had, I was counting, I'm like, I am the 27th pastor of this parish. There's a lot of parishes that don't have that history. I think of my home parish, my parish where I grew up, Our Lady of Good Counsel, only had like 3-4 pastors in its history from when it opened during the baby boom period and when it closed. I think of our neighboring parish, St. Lucy, only had one pastor. He opened it and closed it. And I thought, poor Father Burmester. So there's something to say. And the fact that in our history, 260 plus years of a history as a parish, we've only had 27 pastors. My friend Father Keller is the pastor of Assumption and Matisse in South County, which is also a very historic parish. I think he's their 27th pastor, but they've been around a lot less time than us. But some of it is we've had some long tenures as pastors. So we know what happens with the French. They do. I was going to make my French comment, but I can't because they lost. So they lost. So this territory became under the rule of the Spanish crown. So following Father Giroux, Father Francis Hilaire becomes pastor, and he will see some of this most unique time in the history of our parish and the events of the territory west of the Mississippi. Following the loss of the French and Indian War, the Louisiana Territory becomes under the reign of the Spanish crown. Now here's a fun fact. Someone name the liturgical colors for me. Let's go. Call them out. Green, purple, white, red, black, God love you, right? Gold, gold's good for everything. What color do we not say? Blue, right? Blue is not a liturgical color, but you all know Father Nemeth has a very beautiful and expensive 10th anniversary present to himself that is blue and gold. So if anyone ever pushes me, it's gold with blue accents, but it's blue. Because there is from the 18th century an indult that any territory that was controlled by the Spanish is allowed to wear blue vestments. So we call it the Spanish indult. Now my friends will scream at me and say, that's not true, you can't do that. You were only Spanish for part of the time. And I'm like, sue me. I'm wearing it. It's beautiful. And it cost me $1,000, so I'm wearing it. But this is why these things are important, right? So anyway. During the Spanish rule, the government demanded the right to approve pastor appointments. This is seen quite a bit in the history of the church. In fact, when St. Pius X was elected pope, he was only elected pope because the previous guy elected was vetoed. There were certain empires in Europe that could veto a papal election. So that poor guy got to go home wearing his red, and Giuseppe Sarto got to walk out under the loggia in white. So there is a history, not so much now with the changes in canon law, but there is a history of the government having kind of a say in assignments. Now, Father Hilaire was not exactly in favor with the Spanish government. It was all kind of about him demanding that the Spanish crown is paying his salary, a few other little tax incentives and things like that. So in January 1778, Father Hilaire mysteriously disappears, and the rectory is found left and open and deserted. So write your own story. It's fascinating, right? So for the next 8 years, there was no pastor in St. Genevieve. So for 8 years, this parish existed with no resident pastor. So we had to look to the east for the priest of Kaskaskia to take care of the sacramental needs. Now we kind of have a big moment in the history of the parish, but also history in the town itself. So during the pastorate of Father Paul de Saint-Pierre, the town suffered its greatest disaster in the form of a flood. So the whole town kind of pulled up stakes and moved up the hill, right? And there's a lot of things you can read about the history of what happened to the cemetery and what happened to the church and all that. But the church was basically, from what I've read, taken apart and reassembled. So in 1793, the Spanish lieutenant governor ordered that a church be built on the location where it stands right now. And in 1787, the Spanish also granted a tract of land to be used as a cemetery, 1 block from the church, which is now Memorial Cemetery. It was in that Memorial Cemetery where we see buried, laying in peace, some of our bravest early pioneers alongside slaves and Native Americans and later Americans who would arrive. The records show, and this is a fascinating read, in 1794 there are records that show the list of materials which parishioners furnished to enlarge the log church that was disassembled and brought to the new site. And it is fascinating reading, like, so-and-so, John Smith donated 600 shingles. Like, man, that is the kind of record keeping I like. You know exactly what everybody donated, right? In 1795, we have probably one of our more famous pastors take up his pastorship, and that's Father James Maxwell. He was an Irishman, but Father Maxwell studied for the priesthood in the seminary in Spain. And through some of his workings, he had garnered the favor of the Spanish government. And this really was beneficial for us, because it gave us and allowed us to have tracts of land given to the parish by the Spanish crown. And I do believe that we still own those tracts of land down in the big field, and we farm them, and we make money off them. So, thanks, Father Maxwell. Father Maxwell, of course, because this parish covered such a huge area, he was very devoted to souls, and he traveled everywhere. You will find his name up in Florissant on Sacramento Records. You will find him at St. Michael's in Fredericktown. He was all over. He was very active in the public affairs, which I think as a pastor you should be. You should know what's going on in your town. That's why I've served on the Chamber of Commerce board. I'm on the IDC board right now. I sit on the community board for Mississippi Lime and Wholesome, mainly because I want to protect our interests. But it's good when you're a public figure to be involved in all these endeavors. So when Missouri becomes the Missouri Territory, Father Maxwell is appointed by the President of the United States to what's called the Council of Nine. And he would actually be the chair of that council. Father Maxwell in 1814 was returning home from the parish. The rectory was dilapidated here, so he lived in New Bourbon, and he was going home on his horse when his horse got spooked and he got thrown. So he was thrown from his horse and he was taken to Mrs. Laporte's house at 2nd and Market, which you can go see, and he died there the next morning. Father Maxwell would be buried, is now buried in the current church. And I don't exactly know, I need to do more digging, Bob, you can help me with this, of like where he was buried in the interim and all this. Because in the new Code of Canon Law, which was promulgated in 1983, only cardinals and bishops can be buried in churches, of course. The rest of us priests, we get thrown wherever. But in the 1917 code, which would have been active at this point, you could bury a priest for the right reasons with the permission of the bishop in the church. I'm going to come back to that when we talk about one of my predecessors, Father Van. So Father Maxwell will die, and if you go in that big book, Deanne's big book of sacramental memories, there is the most beautiful handwriting in the world. Father Van had great handwriting, and it is notated in that book where the remains of Father Jacques Maxwell, Father Henry Pratt, and Francois Corset where their remains were what we call in the church translocated to be buried in the current church. Now this comes to a big thing. There's a plaque on the floor at the front pew that says Valley and his wife, Marie Carpenter, are buried there. There is no records they're buried there. In fact, I'll tell you, because we've had men climbing under the church the whole past year, putting in a new HVAC system. They ain't there. So it's one of those things, like the plaque was put there, but Bob, do you agree with that?
Right, he was buried under the pew of the wooden church,
right,
which we believe was next door,
correct,
where the grade school is.
Yeah. That's why Old Valley always feels freaky at night.
But you're right, he was not moved.
Yeah. So a lot of people will say there's 5 bodies buried in church, there's only 3. But if it's going to give me a bigger donation, there's 5 bodies buried in church. Friends, never let truth get in the way of a good story. All right? So, after Father Maxwell, we have Father Henry Pratt. Now this is a very, very important figure. He's not going to make history books, but he's important to our life in St. Genevieve. Father Henry Pratt was the first man born west of the Mississippi to be ordained to the priesthood. That is a big thing. And he came back here then to be pastor in October of 1815. During his tenure, he would be instrumental in arranging Bishop de Burgh's arrival. And later in that same year of 1818, and this, you would really have to dig to find this. You would have to go back and read this saint's diary to see that in August of 1818, the steamboat stopped, as it does, and Father Pratt gave a tour to this young French nun. Now, this French nun was making her way to St. Charles to form an academy, and she would eventually make her way all the way to Kansas in her last years to minister to the Native Americans. In her diary, she talks about the faithfulness and the goodness of the people of St. Genevieve and the holiness of Father Pratt, their pastor. And this sister would eventually become St. Rose Philippine Duchesne. So that's kind of a neat thought that literally, I mean, we probably had a lot of saints that aren't canonized walking through our streets, but know that these streets right here, St. Rose Philippine Duchesne would have walked. In 1822, Father Pratt was instrumental in helping many people during a great epidemic, but he himself contracted the illness and died on September 1st, 1822 at the age of 34. Man, I'm behind. He's met a saint. He's welcomed a bishop. I've lived through a pandemic, but I'm 41, so time's ticking. I got to do some stuff. So Father Pratt is buried next to Father Maxwell under the High Altar Church, and I'll go into more of those details. So now we have a growing town. When Father Xavier Dahmen came to St. Genevieve in September of 1822, the log church had been repaired so many times and was deteriorating so badly and was too small for the growing Catholic population. So a new stone church would be built on the site and eventually was consecrated by Bishop Rosati on November 12, 1837. So this will be what we usually hear in our local history as the stone church. Not a ton of pictures of it, but when you see them, you've kind of seen all of them. So there weren't a lot of pictures back then. But a beautiful little stone church that reminds me much of what the old cathedral looks like right now. Kind of built in that same style. Around the same time, there's a large number of German immigrants starting to arrive. So in this little church, they're giving sermons. So you complain about my homily. You'd have to sit through it in English, German, and French, right? Every Mass. And confessions would be heard in English, German, and French. Though, fun fact, the confessor doesn't need to understand what you're saying. So, like, I have many times been traveling and heard confessions of people that I don't understand a word they're saying. Maybe that's why they chose me. But it's still valid because it's between them and Jesus. I'm just the instrument giving them the absolution. So, enters Father Francis Weiss. Father Weiss was a larger-than-life character, and I mean that. I didn't know how our setup was going to be, but I have a picture of him. A big man. He was built, big old German Alsace-Lorraine kind of built, right? So he becomes pastor here, but originally he was pastor at Zell and their mission at River of Vaz. So he was definitely a visionary and also a builder. And so he actually was the one that built the stone building that still stands next to the church, which we now lovingly call Old Valley, and had been originally tried to recruit Christian brothers to teach, but when they were unable to commit to the mission of education, that became the rectory. The growth of population necessitated the consideration of another enlarging of the existing church, but there really was a call in the Fair Play on May 28th, 1874, to build a whole new church, to build a brick church that would be able to handle this new large population. And this kind of gets into some of the fun stuff about the church that we have. So the cornerstone was laid in April of 1876, and the church began to rise above the town as the largest church in southeast Missouri. It took 600,000 bricks to make that church. Now, if you ever go up through the organ and up into the stairwell and the creaky, scary ladders that go all the way up to the bells, you see the magnificence of the stonework. In fact, if you go under the church, you will still find ladders from the bricklayers there, and even kind of worn where their feet were. It is to think that in the 1870s they were building such a magnificent structure. The roof was completed and covered with slate on 1787. Now, friends, never skimp on a roof, because we've got about 20 years left of that roof, and that is the original slate roof. So the finance, right? Yeah, so the finance council and I, we are putting a long-range plan together of how to do some deferred maintenance budgeting to make sure we are ready to put a new, and the roof actually is in very good shape, but I don't want my successor to have to deal with that headache, because that roof will now take probably $1 million to replace, and you can bet we're putting slate back on it. So another 160 years it'll still be standing. This is why I'm going to go off script. This is why I don't write my homilies. I get so confused. On November 1st, 1879, the 13-foot cross was placed at the top of the steeple, which was rising 193 feet in the air and visible for miles. The new church was constructed around the old rock church, and services and masses were still celebrated in the rock church while this church was being built around it. It wasn't until the last moment, when construction was finished, that they would have moved the altar into the new church. So if you crawl under the church, you see these beautiful hand-hewn beams that are the support of the church, and they're resting on this old stone foundation of the 1830s stone church. It's beautiful. So if you look in the church, those interior pillars are sitting on the foundation of the older church. Now there's a homily in there, but you got to come to Mass to hear it. After the church was done, they took it apart and walked it right out the front of the building. I would have loved to have been there to see that. It must have been such an amazing feat of engineering construction to see a church being built around another church and then disassembled and carried out. Okay. So originally, we're going to talk a little bit about this church. So when this church was completed, it is not the church that we understand right now. If you look in the church towards the sanctuary, you're going to see this beam going across. Now, in English architecture, it would be called a rood screen, kind of like you see in Westminster Abbey, the separation of the choir area and the sanctuary from the faithful. So we call it, for lack of a better term, a rood beam. So that main arch over the sanctuary, that beam exists. That would have been the back wall of the church. And also the church was a square. Where the accessible entrance is and where the baptismal font is, those were just straight walls. Okay, so that's how the church was originally built. So then we'll talk a little bit about how that expanded. So when this church was built, the seating capacity was 962 people. The parish had 450 families. Population of the town was 2,000. At that time, there were 2 bells in the tower weighing 305 pounds and 605 pounds. The cost to build was $25,000.
Wow.
Now, I went on to Google, like, what is $25,000 at that time versus now? And they said about $770,000. But that's not including the marble that will be added later, because I'm having someone down to the diocese to do an appraisal of what the marble is. I'm sure we have about $3 million of marble in that church. Marble ain't cheap, friends. It ain't cheap. Father Weiss celebrated. So Father Weiss actually designed the church pretty much from the roof down. He designed everything about it, oversaw the construction. He celebrated his golden jubilee, his 50th year as a priest. He was the first priest in the Archdiocese of St. Louis to ever reach that milestone. And on March 3rd, 1901, he passed away. He's buried in Valley Springs in the priest lot. So as you drive into Valley Springs, you have that kind of circle drive. He's, of course, the biggest, as befitting his stature and his legend, he's the biggest monument right there in the priest lot. I already have my spot picked out, by the way. I told Patty, this is where I'm going, right here. Right next to summer housing, so I can pick them all throughout the church and say, why did you take that out? Why didn't you destroy that? That's the only reason I want to be there. So. After this, we have one of my favorite characters in the history, and I don't know, does anyone remember Father Van? Does anyone?
Oh, yes.
May not want to.
Definitely.
Yeah?
Yes.
You should give the lecture then.
No.
So Father Charles Van Torenhout, good Irish name, right? Father Van Torenhout was known as Father Van. Father Van was an associate pastor here for 11 years, and then he was given the tap to become the pastor. Father Van will always be remembered and known for his love of the church building, and especially the sacred liturgy. Some of the things we use at Mass every day belong to Father Van. That little gold cruet set with the water and wine on it, that was in my bedroom closet when I got here. I thought, well, that's kind of a weird thing to have in your bedroom. But that was a gift from the altar boys and the Mary Sodality in 1935, which was one of his ordinations, the anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood. So I thought, why are we not using this? This is beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful and functional. It's even better. It's functional. I think of when Father Weiss celebrated that Golden Jubilee, the parish gave him what's called a missal stand, that golden thing that the book sits on. Now, we only pull it out for the bigger feast days, but so when Christmas and Easter and some bigger feast days, you'll see a bigger one, and it's got the beautiful inscription on it to Father Francis X. Weiss, and the gift and his ordination of priesthood and the date. Like these are beautiful things, but they're not museum pieces. We use them. And the fact that we're using them 100 plus years later shows they used to build them a little bit better than now.
Where'd you find that piece?
That was in a closet somewhere.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll get to some of my history. Yeah. That wasn't in my bathroom or anything. I didn't put my reading on it when I was sitting in the tub. So Father Van was known for big liturgies. At this point, there would have been, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Father Van expanded the church to the footprint that it holds now, starting in 1911. Fun fact, we were doing some exploring in the attic of church. So when you look at the ceiling of the church, there's actually a 15-foot space between there and the roof. And you access it going up to the steeple. So you walk on this beam and you see all the woodwork. And we've had engineers come in to look at it when we were looking at the the roof and all that. And they're like, this is really good craftsmanship. Like, no wear, no deterioration from termites. When you get all the way to the end, you can see where they expanded the church. And when we were up there, Bill Lurk found a newspaper from 1917. Oh. It was just laying there, and it's like, wow. So it's in our archives of the parish. So Father Van, that sanctuary was expanded. That new beautiful high altar that we have was built in 1920, that baldacchino. So anytime you have a little dome over an altar, it's called a baldacchino. So the baldacchino was put in. I think Mrs. Rozier was the one who paid for that because her name's on it. So that baldacchino was there, and that's when we see the translation of the remains of Father Maxwell, Father Pratt, and Francois Corset. So as you're looking at the altar in the Old Mass, there's the Gospel side and the Epistle side. Gospel side is Father Maxwell. The Epistle side is Father Pratt. And behind the altar on the wall is huge memorial stone tablets. And they're all written in French, denoting their birth and ordination and death and all that. Father Van loved his big liturgies. Those choir stalls were put in, and when people who don't know this area come in, they always say, like, is this a cathedral? Because choir stalls like that are very rare in parish churches. If you don't have canons and you don't have kind of a particular schola cantorum that's going to be utilizing them, Father Van just liked to shove as many servers as he could up there. And I think when it comes to that, Father Van and I are kindred spirits. So if you come to the 8:30 Mass, I don't get to show up, you're not scheduled to serve, get your ass up there. Put a casket and serve. That's all. We're going to make Father Van proud. So Father Van loved the liturgies, and he revived the tradition of the Corpus Christi procession. He enhanced the tradition of the singing of the old French songs at midnight Mass at Christmas. So particularly when you come, Bill and Patty do the Mass at the early Christmas Eve Mass, and it's like sitting and listening to music they probably would have been listening to 100, 150, 180 years ago in this church. These beautiful French carols, German carols. So there's something very unique even in our current celebration of the liturgy that is so tied to our history here at the church. Father Van will probably be most known for founding of Valley High School. In 1925, he built the current rectory, where I live now, and the high school opened in the old stone house next to the church, which again we refer to as Old Valley. Father Van was well-traveled, and he was actually the only one of his class from a seminary that wasn't made a bishop. I always wonder how he probably felt about that. Like, everybody else is running around bishops, and here's Father Van. But in his travels to Rome, over the course of years, he would bring back relics from Rome. So a relic is either a piece of bone or flesh or blood of a saint. Now, we're Americans, and we're kind of puritanical, so we look at that and we're like, ugh. But like, man, you're Europeans, we're hacking saints apart like crazy, man. Like, fun fact, if you go to Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which is the only Gothic-style church in the city of Rome, Saint Catherine of Siena is buried there. Now remember, relics were a huge draw. People would come to your town to see this relic of the saint. Huge pilgrimages. And you know what that meant? Cha-ching! Right? Right? The innkeepers are getting their piece, the restaurants are getting their piece, and all these little souvenirs are getting sold. So St. Catherine of Siena visits Rome and dies. So the folks in Siena say, all right, send her back. The Romans are like, nope. So the people from Siena snuck into Rome, cut off her head and one of her fingers, and when you go to Siena, that's what you'll find of St. Catherine. But the rest of her body is in Rome at Santa Maria sopra Minerva. So, right? They're brutal. They're brutal. See, Father Van doesn't look so bad bringing little pieces back, you know. So he would bring back over 80 relics of saints. And I'll tell you, like, I'm going through some of the reliquaries, and we have some records. There's some saints that we don't have on the records. And it's hard because they're all in Latin, and you can't really read them very well. But it is an impressive collection of relics that we have. He was also, Father Van was a very good friend of then Archbishop John Glennon. So Archbishop Glennon was Archbishop for like 40 years. And he followed Kenrick, who was Archbishop for like 50 years. Like, these guys would not give up. Glennon gets named a cardinal. So when you're named a cardinal, you travel to Rome. The Pope gives you your red hat, signifying you're a cardinal. So Glennon invited Father Van to come with him. Of course, he's a very good friend. Father Van was very advanced in years and was not well at the time. So this was in 1946. Now, we know the story. Cardinal Glennon will get his red hat in Rome, do his little victory tour, and he'll stop in his hometown in Ireland, and he'll die unexpectedly. So St. Louis's first cardinal came back in a box. A year later, Father Van would die. Father Van's funeral, and Bob had sent me the newspaper clipping. It must have been an impressive mass. The mass was celebrated by then Archbishop Ritter. The homilist was Monsignor Martin Hellriegel. What a great Irish name, Hellriegel, right? So Martin Hellriegel was the pastor of Holy Cross in Baby, so the neighboring parish to where I grew up. And Hellriegel was very, very influential in kind of the liturgical reforms in the 40s and 50s. But that's a whole other lecture for another day. So Hellriegel composed that great hymn that we sing so often, To Jesus Christ Our Sovereign King. That is a Martin Hellriegel composition. So it was Hellriegel that preached Father Van's Requiem Mass. Now, Father Van was supposed to be buried in the church. They went so far as cut a spot out in the floor to drop him in. Now, Ritter was a bit of an egomaniac, and nobody was going to be buried in the church before Ritter was. So he said no. So Father Van Torenhout is buried in the chapel at Valley Springs Cemetery. And there's this huge stone plaque on the ground in the chapel where he's buried, which fits a huge spot in our sanctuary. When you look at it at an angle, it has kind of a little washboard look to it, because that would have been where they cut it up to bury Father Van. By the way, when I say washboard to the kids at school nowadays, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, how are we doing? I'm having a good time. You having a good time? So Father Van passed away on April 25th of 1947 after 46 years of service as a pastor and 11 years as an associate. Please God, leave me here that long. Okay? His mark on our liturgy is really the beauty that still exists. Now, after Father Van, we see some changes, and some of you may remember some of these. There were some changes kind of leading up to the Second Vatican Council and the reforms of the sacred liturgy, moving from the Latin Mass that we may have been familiar with to the Novus Ordo as we celebrate it now. So Mass was celebrated on kind of a makeshift wooden table, freestanding, okay, with the priest facing the people. Father Van's predecessor was not so big on the ornamentation. So above the tabernacle, we have what's called the throne, which is that little mini dome over the tabernacle. You know what I'm talking about? Where the cross is?
Right.
So apparently that was removed and smashed into, like, I heard 190-something pieces. That may be true. That sure sounds good, so we'll go with it. And the parishioners saw this and were so horrified that for like 40 years, these pieces sat in someone's garage. And it was in the 90s, or maybe even before that, maybe during the time of, I think it was during the pastorship of Monsignor Greg Schmidt, that it was reassembled. And when you're crawling up there to clean and decorate for Christmas, you can see the spots where they had to put this puzzle back together. The sanctuary lamp that we have, that is now electric, would have hung in the middle, and Father wanted to get rid of it. So the original donor of that was a lady by the name of Betty Dunsey. And she wasn't too pleased with that. So Betty Dunsey had a sanctuary lamp for about 50 years in her living room. Listen, there are so many churches you go to, they're not renovated, they're what I call recavated. And I think of one of the biggest ones is Saints Peter and Paul in Soulard, this beautiful Gothic church towering over everything. And you walk in and you just want to weep because it has been so destroyed. When I walked into this church for the first time in 2017 in the spring, it was like, oh, thank God. The communion rail's still here. Like no pastor went crazy. And when they did go crazy, the people just kind of held back. And I wish they would have saved the other row of choir stalls, because there should be a row on the floor level for those that were removed. And the old confessionals. There's a piece of them down in the basement. But you know how much it costs to get those made now? It's exorbitant. So what I appreciate is the people of St. Genevieve. I don't care if you're the pastor. This is our church. So you're not taking pieces out. And if you are, I'm going to hide them until someone who has more sense comes into the pastor. So we see the restoration, I think under Father Dennis Schmidt's term of the sanctuary lamp. And then we'll see another liturgical thing. The current freestanding altar that we have came from the great church in North City called St. Laborious. Yeah. Monstrous, gorgeous Gothic church. And I'm now I should have wrote it down because I'm totally blanking on the name of the gentleman that was instrumental in that. Help me out.
Father Midas.
Frank Udy, yes. It was Frank Udy that went and kind of, first of all, they had to reinforce the floor.
Right.
So our freestanding altar actually is two side altars that are kind of squished together. So if you pull back the altar cloth, you see the seam and everything. It's gorgeous. I mean, as freestanding altars go, it's gorgeous and it fits in with what we have. It was almost like Father Van would have planned it. So I'm always very thankful to Frank. And I remember before Frank passed, him talking to me a little bit about that whole project. Here we go. Next thing we're talking about is a little bit about the history of Catholic education, and we're kind of coming to the end before I talk a little bit about what does the future look like. For all the things the Catholic Church gets harped on as like being anti-science, like I have never understood that. Anybody who's half informed understands the Catholic Church was the one institution that kept the light of knowledge alive during the Dark Ages. It was the founder of the first universities. The Big Bang Theory, which everybody says like, oh, you're Catholic, you don't believe in the Big Bang Theory. Like, it was a priest-scientist that came up with the Big Bang Theory. There's 27 moons on the craters on the moon named after Jesuit missionaries. So the church is not antithetical to science at all. In fact, education has always been kind of one of the hearts of what we do. Education plays an important role in the story of St. Genevieve. In fact, 10 years prior to that big 1818 that SLU throws around, the Christian Brothers founded the Academy in 1808. And I always hate, every year at Catholic Schools Week, the Archdiocese puts out this list of the top 10 schools that have been around the longest. And we're nowhere on the list. And I'll write them an email. I'm like, Well, we're just doing that have been continuously in operation. And I'm like, we were the frontier. Like, there were times we had to churn butter and stuff. We didn't have time to do all this. So they stopped doing it because every year I would send a horrible email to John Schwob, who I really like. But I'm like, John, at least throw us a bone. Like, 10 years before SLU, Catholic education was in St. Genevieve. So if the academy, which you're all familiar with, up on the hill next to St. Genevieve Public School, was that first Catholic school. In the early 1784, Madame Charles Peyroux, I'm not good at the French, by the way, Peyroux brought the dames of the religious to St. Genevieve with the intention of starting a school for girls. They weren't here long, and then in 1837, the Sisters of Loretto, led by Odile Pratt Valley. How many names can we fit into one name that's recognizable, right? Odile Pratt Valley came to St. Genevieve. Now, Odile Valley had been widowed twice. And after the last time, she thought, all right, I'm done. She became a nun, okay? But she had wealth, and with her wealth, she financed the purchase of the Catherine Bolduc House. And then in 1849, the school moved to the Joseph Pratt residence opposite of the church. In 1858, the Loretto sisters left, and Father St. Cyr brought in the Sisters of St. Joseph, and many of you were taught by the Sisters of St. Joseph. So the Sisters of St. Joseph would educate the children of our community for over 130 years. In fact, anybody remember Sister Helen Ryan? Yeah, that would have been like past some of your times and before some of your other. She taught at Chaminade for a while with a good friend of mine, and she had just passed away. But she was at a time here, and I want to meet people who know her because she was a character. Like, I would want to hear those stories. It was like when the sisters came down to visit. Some of the St. Joseph sisters came for a visit one day, and we were walking around, and they were telling us how when they were teaching in Old Valley at lunchtime, they'd go down to the basement and have wine to get through the day. Needless to say, I've changed our policy with our faculty. They were hilarious. Those sisters were hilarious. They were hilarious. So the question is, how does a public school get named after the saint, and the private school, Catholic school, gets named after the person? Money! Felix and Odile Pratt Valley were very interested in Catholic education, and in 1874 gave $7,500 to the sisters to maintain 3 sisters to be here. And in 1893, the sisters moved to a 3-story school building built just east of the convent, which would remain in use until 1954 with the construction of New Valley. So if you look at older pictures, you see these 2 monstrous, beautiful buildings, which would be where the parish center is and where the desert is now. That would have been the convent and would have been the school. And of course, we see with the building of New Valley, it looks like every other school in the Archdiocese built in the 50s. A new convent was built next to it, which has now gone the way of most of these convents. It's now offices. The sisters, I really have to say something to the sisters in education. The sisters did a thankless job for almost no pay. Their life was one of stoicism and asceticism, and they gave their life so willingly to the gospel and the formation of children. And many of us who were taught by sisters, it is very hard to replicate that love. Now, we all talk about the nuns that slapped you with rulers. Like, listen, you got 50 kids in a room, you use whatever you can. Plus, back then, everybody was hitting students. It wasn't like the nuns cornered the market. So, I mean, we still have school districts that use corporal punishment in this state. So, like, I don't want to hear about the sisters. But if you're ever taught by a nun, you know that though they can be horribly terrifying at times, they are just such great signs of God's love. And I'm very thankful to the sisters who taught here for over a century before they left here in 1996. So where do we go from here? History's fun. It's great to talk about history. It's great to learn about dates. But when we understand the history of a church, we're not talking about a static reality that exists only in the past, but a living reality that's constantly breathing, organically developing and changing. And I think about this right now in our present history of the church in the Archdiocese as we go through the All Things New strategic plan for parishes. I sit back and listen to people and they say like, oh, well, this, if this, we don't have Mass here, if we don't have Mass here. Like I want to go back to one of the pages and say, we went without priests for a month at a time because they were traveling to bring the sacraments. And the people didn't complain. They were so thankful when they were able to receive the sacraments. One of my thoughts is sometimes that the church has made everything so convenient, nobody has to prioritize their life. And then if the church doesn't have the Mass time that works for my travel basketball team and my whatever team and this thing that I got to do and my work and my vacation schedule, well, then it's the church's fault. No. These great pioneers that landed here, their faith was so important to them, they built a whole town around this faith. So when I look at the future may our parish structures look a little different? Yeah, but that doesn't mean we're defeated. It doesn't mean the end. It means we're evolving. Don't forget, our current structure of the Archdiocese came about during the baby boom. I want to say like 60 to 70% of our parishes were built during the baby boom period. But population shift, things change. Do we have a priest shortage? Maybe, because we have a structure that was only able to exist and be sustained for a 20 to 30 year period. The majority of priests in the Archdiocese were ordained in the 70s and are about to retire. But they also were a product of the baby boom period. There were just more people. There were just more people to go into the vocations. So I don't look at this as a doom and gloom thing. To be a person of faith and to be a believer in history, to be a believer in the church, means we're never doom and gloom. We look at like, what's the next adventure? What's the next challenge we have? And the challenges we face now, whether that means I got to drive 10 more minutes to Mass or my Mass time has been moved by an hour, is nothing compared to the pioneers that built this town, that built this church, that labored on the most unstructurally sound ladders. Now Vern Bowman will say, those ladders are good. If they're given, that means they're not going to break. I'm like, my 280 pounds gets on that ladder, it ain't going to waver. No, when it's waving, it's good. So what I'm getting at is, these are people that had such courage in how they live their faith. Courage to leave their homes to find a better life and to establish a whole new world. Who went into the wilderness, into the areas that had never been explored. But their faith was with them all the time. Think of all these explorers had priests with them. Father Marquette, Father de Smet. These great names. So yeah, things will change a little bit for us, but it doesn't change the root of who we are. And it should never make us discouraged. Just because things might not look how they used to in certain regards, it doesn't change the core of who we are or why we are. So in my little journey through history tonight, and it was only a little journey, there is a lot of stuff out there about this. I hope you'll take away from this that faith was important to people. It was the priority of their lives around which they ordered everything else. That people set off with great courage and built this magnificent structure of a church that we have. But the other lesson to take away from that is the church isn't buildings. It is not an organization. It's not a corporation. The church, as the Second Vatican Council says, is the people of God. And we're a pilgrim people. We're a people journeying back to the Father. So when we gather together and worship at Mass, when we gather together as a people of faith, we're gathering together as a people on a journey together. And I'm really excited to see what the next 100 years brings for this community as well. Because I believe this is a community that will always be moving forward, but always rooted in our history and our traditions. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Thanks for your kind attention.
So a couple of things to clean up and clarify. The stone church that was torn down, Vernon Bowman took it out of there. And at this point, I had to stop Father because he wanted me to pass the basket for you to pay for that ornament or that gown he was talking about, the gold and blue, $1,000. That wasn't brought up by accident.
I'm willing for the shilling.
And he said, we never get this many people in a room without passing a basket. So, clarification for everybody. You paid to be here. Again, on your way out, if you stop and you like the things that we're bringing, Kaskaskia Island, the New Madrid earthquake, get you an annual membership. If you come back 3 times, 4 times, it pays for itself. So thank you very much for being here. Father, thank you for the great presentation. We are open. Feel free to go visit around the museum, go upstairs, look what we've got. We've got the history of Sainte Genevieve up there, of our original museum that started in 1935. And then we've got the great collection of Guy Darrell here. Everything else in here belongs to Guy Darrell. One man owns everything on this floor and biggest part of upstairs. So feel free to roam around. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.